Good morning, Dan. And in for Amy this morning is Chicago Tribune editorial board member Kristen McQuarrie. And Kristen, this is interesting, and we talk about college campuses a lot, these institutions of higher education that aren't anymore, and largely are not. There are exceptions, of course. The Ivy League. James Freeman brings this to us to the Wall Street Journal. Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, has one of the most selective application processes in the country. Just 8% of its applicants are admitted. And when they're admitted, they receive a letter of admission from the admissions dean, who is Logan Powell at present. And one journal reader has a daughter who was accepted. And in the letter, which is addressed to her parent or guardian, Dean Powell stated that our reader's daughter had no doubt worked hard and made positive contributions to their school and community. They are accepted to Brown University. And before they thought it was a grammatical error, before they listened to a voicemail message from the school congratulating his daughter and referring to her as them. It turns out, as you know where this is going, the errors were intentional. Brown spokesman Brian Clark writes in an email that our admission office typically refers to applicants either by first name or using they, their pronouns. While the grammatical construction may read as unfamiliar to some, it has been adopted by many newsrooms and other organizations as a gender-inclusive option. So, interesting how inclusion provides no opportunity for disagreement. If I'm a man, I'd like to be referred to as he. If I'm a woman, I'd like to be referred to as she. I'm sorry, we're inclusive. You don't have a choice. You're they.
I wouldn't say newsrooms are abiding that at all. We're pretty sticklers for it's for singular and he, she. Not that I've noticed anyway, but
She, they, the daughter, may want to consider another choice other than Brown if she was smart and accomplished enough to get into Brown. There are schools that are more interested in developing her intellectual capacity than Brown apparently is. But for more on, not this topic specifically, but the ideas industry at present generally, I was interested in this book after I read a piece by David Brooks from the New York Times, because I like to know what Susan Collins is thinking. That's why I read David Brooks. The Age of Wonkery, and he focuses on a book by a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, Daniel Drezner, who kind of updates us on how we've changed as a culture from public intellectuals who drive cultural norms and aspirations to think tanks and policy wonks that act as legislative advisors, and what the implications of that metamorphosis are. And we're pleased to be joined by Professor Drezner for more on this topic. Professor Drezner, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
And so your review, or I should say Brooks's review of your book, includes this observation that you're essentially arguing intellectuals, public intellectuals as they previously existed, were critical, skeptical, tended to be pessimistic. Now we have idea evangelists who do TED Talks and other kind of social media distribution of their ideas and are more singularly focused rather than kind of commenting on a particular idea or policy in the context of larger culture. And if that's true and a fair representation of one of the arguments you're lodging, what are the implications of that for said culture?
Right. So the way I make the argument, you guys are reasonably smart. I'm sure you're familiar with an essay that Isaiah Berlin wrote called The Hedgehog and the Fox.
Mm-hmm.
The fox is someone who knows a little bit about a lot. The hedgehog is someone who knows one big thing. So what I call public intellectuals in the books function like Isaiah Berlin's foxes. They're critics. They can tell you everything that is wrong with everyone else's idea. The thought leaders are the hedgehogs. The thought leaders have one big idea that they think can explain everything. So here I suppose I would descend a little bit from the way Brooks is characterizing my argument, in the sense that my depiction of thought leaders in the book are people who aren't just necessarily focusing on one policy idea or that might be where they started, but they think that their idea can explain everything, and therefore can be applied not just to their one little policy bailiwick, but can be applied to a whole variety of others. So, for example, think about the language of disruption in business, the idea of disruptive innovation in business. That's certainly an idea that actually has some degree of utility, particularly in places like Silicon Valley. But you're now seeing it trying to be applied to things like, among other things, reorganizing the federal government. And I would suggest that might be an overgeneralization of that term.
Is your general premise that our shift kind of to the TED Talk type of thought leader is necessarily a bad thing, or what are the drawbacks of it, and what are the positive sides?
No, that's a great question, Kristen, because I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. It's easy for particularly public intellectuals or academics to be very curmudgeonly and complain about that it used to be better before. I'm arguing that it was bad before. It's bad now, just in a slightly different way. I don't think we should begrudge the existence of TED Talks. I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily that you've got a large number of people that want to listen to interesting talks in the span of 20 minutes. I would say two things on this. The first is that I don't just want to hear TED Talks. I want to hear TED Talks with discussants. My problem with the TED Talk phenomenon is not the talk itself. It's that it always ends on this sort of standing ovation where you hear the idea, but you don't hear potentially what is potentially wrong with it. And to really have a functioning marketplace of ideas, you don't just need to hear the idea, you need to hear the criticism of it. And in terms of the trends that have caused this, the reason you're seeing the rise of TED Talks, the reason you're seeing the rise of thought leaders is essentially an erosion of trust in authority and expertise that's been a 50-year trend. You're seeing the rise of political polarization where each side only wants their sort of own in-house intellectuals. And these two trends sort of aid and abet people who are willing to speak to a particular audience that essentially has a preconceived worldview and wants to hear that worldview confirmed.
So you're saying part of the problem then is silos, is everybody can,
Yes.
Because of the democratization of media and and the nature of the fragmentation of audiences, I can just focus on people who largely agree with me or are inclined to, and I don't have to take on those that may be constructively critical of my ideas.
That's correct. So it becomes very easy, for example, if someone says this particular policy idea is wrong and they're coming from a university, for conservatives to say, well, that's just a liberal, elite, leftist, out-of-touch academic. And if, on the other hand, let's say someone from the Heritage Foundation says this regulatory idea that you're suggesting is probably not going to work and it'll cost more money than it'll save, it's easy for liberals to say, well, that guy's coming from the Heritage Foundation. Of course, he's going to have his own ideological axe to grind.
So do we have a need for a return of firing line where Bill Buckley has a team of conservative intellectuals and John Kenneth Galbraith has a team of liberal intellectuals, and they kind of go at it on a particular topic? Would that be productive to see?
I actually do think that would be productive. To put it bluntly, I think I prefer Hannity and Combs to just Hannity. Is the way to think about it.
Right.
And remember, Jon Stewart, I think about 12 or 13 years ago, trashed the idea of CNN's Crossfire, arguing that this was bad television and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to defend all of these shows as always being, paragons from the Algonquin Round Table. But that said, I do think that at least arguing different points of view on television is far superior to having, as you say, a sort of ideologically siloed show where Hannity just has only people who are sympathetic to Hannity on his program.
Yeah, totally agree.
Do you get a sense that just a lack of attention span too plays into this? Because I think the 20-minute TED Talks, and I'm kind of a fan, I have to admit, I like to listen to the podcasts on the weekends. I'll ring something up, but I wonder if that 20-minute segment and what you're referring to is because we do have just a shortened attention span to listen to an intellectual argument.
I think that might be part of it, although I would point out that the sort of rise of podcasts more generally over the last year actually suggests that sometimes people do have a longer attention span because a lot of these podcasts are longer than TED Talks. And the fact that you have people willing to listen to them suggests that maybe there's still a thirst for a longer argument. And again, as I said, I don't necessarily think that having to make an argument in just 20 minutes is necessarily damning in the sense that means, it must be shallow or superficial or what have you. It's what you say in those 20 minutes that counts. And if you have that kind of constraint, it forces you to make sure that you're making the most important points of your argument. But that said, of course, I just wrote a whole book, and I would much rather people read the whole book than necessarily just read the headline and try to infer what I'm arguing from that.
Well, that's a fair point. And what about the nature of kind of deconstructionism, the impact of that, and the kind of my truth era we're living in? There's no absolute truth. There's just my truth, and you're living your truth, and they're morally and substantively equivalent. Yeah, I mean, it kind of, aren't we in the place that Hegel and Nietzsche wanted us to be in some respects? And so that prevents some agreement on what cultural goods are that perhaps we had once upon a time when you had public intellectuals like Isaiah Berlin that were looked to for guidance.
Let me just pause here and point out that I've never had to talk about Hegel on a morning talk show, so congratulations.
Welcome to Dan Croft. Not a thought leader, an intellectual.
Well, I mean, you know, Nietzsche said that Christianity, speaking of this Easter weekend, was the one great curse, and he was, you know.
To answer your question, I would push back. I don't think Hegel was necessarily pushing that in his arguments, but I take your point on Nietzsche. I think the way to think about it is not so much personal truth; it's now about narratives. There was a great profile in the New Yorker right before the campaign ended, the 2016 campaign ended, of a guy named Mike Cernovich, who's now well known as sort of a Trump loyalist, although now recently he doesn't sound as thrilled about it. But he had put out a fair amount of so-called fake news about Hillary Clinton and so on and so forth. And he was interviewed about why he was doing this, and he gave this great answer, which I quote in the book, where he said, "Look, I went to college. I read Lacan. I know that if there's a dominant narrative, the way that I can combat that is by trying to produce a counter-narrative." And so that's what you're seeing now sometimes in debates. And the question becomes, can you hear a counter-narrative and assess it credibly or not? Or is it the case that these narratives are simply bound up in identity, in which point it becomes difficult for those not with the same identity to understand that narrative at all?
Yeah, so one of the things that I hear you saying in terms of the detractions of this new era we're living in is polarization that isn't substance-based. So, for example, going back to my firing line example, I could respect a John Kenneth Galbraith for his intellect, even if I disagree with some of his conclusions in terms of how they translate into policy. And now we can't respect anybody who disagrees with us because they're just part of the enemy camp.
Right. Actually, the survey evidence on this is really alarming. The degree to which now you have, and there's a genuine question about how much the country itself is really polarizing, or is it something else, that a phenomenon that political scientists call partisan sorting, which means that essentially you had people, let's say Democrats in the South, that now realize that they're Republicans, or Republicans in the Northeast who realize now they're Democrats. But the important point is that essentially you now have sort of partisans on both sides who basically think that the other side is actually less intelligent, or don't want their children to marry people from that ideological persuasion. There's survey evidence that shows that both Democrats and Republicans will discriminate in terms of job hiring based on politics far more than they will based on race or gender, which is an alarming fact.
Interesting. He is Daniel Drezner, professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and the book is The Ideas Industry. Professor Drezner, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you so much for having me.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.